Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Python Community News, the show that brings the latest updates around the Python community. I am your host, Jay, and with me, as always, is the awesome co-host.
I'm John.
Hey, John, how's it going?
Good. How you doing, Jay?
Good. We've got kind of a I don't want to say a meta topic because I don't think we're going to be bringing up meta at all. But we have a really good question around who is responsible for the things that we use in our day to day, and ultimately, are we okay with that? But before we do that, I think we have one bit of quick news. Um, the PSF is actually hiring. So if you are in the community event space, the PSF might need you. They're looking for a community events manager. We've talked with some people recently from the PSF about all of the different events that they do that not only support like PyCon US, but some of the other things around there. John, you do community events. Like you do a big community event. Like what are some of the big needs for a role that of like this magnitude?
Yeah, I mean, I do a community event that is significantly smaller than PyCon US, which is the PSF's kind of biggest event that this person would be contributing to. But a lot of it's going to be uh, all the behind the scenes stuff year round that people don't see that go into planning an event, right? So this is making sure all the gears are turning and that right at the event when everyone is right going to check in, pick up their badge all the way through, right? We're closing down the event for the year. Sprints are wrapping up. There's a ton of work that goes on behind the scenes to make sure that those things happen smoothly, to make sure that all the different vendors that are involved in making one of these events come to life, work together as they should. So there's putting on a conference like this is a pretty big production, and so an events manager in that space would work on any and all aspects of it. And the post here recommend or also mentions that there are other PSF events throughout the year that this person would also contribute to.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like this is the part of Python, honestly, that we want to expose more of, showing people that there are jobs that kind of extend past the lines of code that you might write in your day to day. And, honestly, when you're dealing with a project or, as big as PyCon, like you don't necessarily need good Python developers to put on PyCon. You need people who are skilled at dealing with contracts, people who are skilled with planning events and like coordinating these things. And if they happen to be in the Python community, that's a benefit too. But ultimately, just like we would want, we have skilled web developers, we have skilled data scientists, like the Python community needs skilled event planners and skilled, legal writers and copywriters and things like that to really make the community as, I guess, as prominent as it is, especially when you're dealing with PyCon, which we talked about this a few weeks ago. PyCon is not just the largest event, but it's also one of the largest sources of income for the PSF. So you really need to make sure that you can put on the most successful event possible.
Yeah, and I mean to your point about right the kinds of work that go into events like this. Um, right, I've been in the situation of right, I wanna start a new event, and right, the first thing I'm gonna do is build a web framework so that I can host it. It's very tempting as someone who right works in that space, but that's not only is that um, a core competency you don't necessarily need here, but it's one that might even distract you, right?
Yeah.
So you know, the job of running an event like this at the end of the day should be pretty far removed from a lot of the uh, you know, software development sides of things. Even though it's an event about software development, right? Putting on the event is event planning, which is a very different process and skill set than building a website.
Yeah. Yeah. So if you or someone you know is looking for work and they have some, event planning or an event planning background or some knowledge in that space, then head over to python.org's website. It is a blog post currently. I think it might even be in their job board.
This is on the job board, and it'll also be
Yeah.
linked directly in the newsletter.
Exactly. Which, speaking of, you can subscribe to that newsletter. Just go to. We really need a vanity link for that, don't we? There will be a vanity link eventually, but for now, you can head over to our website, which is pythoncommunitynews.com, and from there will be a link to the newsletter as well, where you can subscribe. Moving on, there's some companies that deal with data, and there are companies that deal with the data community, and apparently they're starting to partner together to get a little bit more metrics on open source projects. And I say all that to say Anaconda is partnering with NumFocus and Bitergia to bring community metrics to all of the projects within the NumFocus umbrella. Bitergia is an analytics platform. They do analytics and charts and dashboards. So I don't have any other correlation to other than something like a BI object, but for code and things like that. But the team at Anaconda is helping to fund this partnership and bring more information around project health and security and transparency across all of the projects that NumFocus is a part of. And honestly, for this conversation, I mean, this is a little bit of a harder topic for me because I'm not a data scientist, nor do I pretend. Well, I do pretend to be one from time to time, but I have seen other companies out there that are focusing on giving metrics around open source projects, and I'm just wondering, like, John, do you have any insight to where, like, how some of these metrics get used either by companies or vendors or people just wanting to make sure that they are making the right choice?
Yeah, I mean, so this will come up a lot when you're talking about things like selecting a new library to use for a particular application within your product, right? So if you have um, a need for one of these libraries, you're evaluating 3, 5 different options. Um, you'll look at things like the right, how actively maintained something is, right? If it hasn't seen an update in the past 4 years, you may be hesitant to bring it on as a dependency, because then that's something that now you may be responsible for maintaining long term. Versus if a community is healthy, right, around a project, and you are building more and more on top of something that is widely used and has funding and responds to security reports, things like that. That takes some of the worry about maintenance burden away. And I think also, this ties back into a couple of things we've talked about in episodes maybe last month around, right, the federal government in the U.S. Looking at right, security for open source projects that are used by their own services, right? And so as um, as end users of libraries require these sorts of metrics and information around right? The health, both right, maintainability wise and security wise, of a project, whether those end users are right governments or companies or individuals. Um, these are going to be more important things to be able to say, yeah, we have this data, we can show you, or right. So one way or another, you're going to want to be able to answer these questions if your goal is to make your libraries available for use by those sorts of people.
And I mean, to me, there is a second part of that too, which we will talk probably a lot more about in the next topic, which is like funding. Like the government, at least the US government, has a history of throwing money at the problem, even when the problem isn't necessarily fully understood. But in order to qualify for catching that money being thrown, there are a lot of things that you have to do. There are a lot of things that you have to show. And this could be a way to starting to codify some of those things. I know that like even when it comes to like digital privacy and things like that, there are things that you are on the hook for. If someone says, the right to be forgotten, that's a thing. I want to be forgotten. Like you have to provide receipts of like, hey, here are the records showing that we had your data, we did this thing, and now the data is not there anymore. I'm not saying that that's necessarily what this is, but what I think it is starting to put in place around, when it talks about project health and security, okay, how many of those vulnerabilities, how many of those CVEs, we talked about last week, there are thousands of proof of concepts that are malicious in nature. Like the code itself is malicious and it's out in the public and people know about it, but there's not enough people to triage all of the malicious objects, let alone they're fighting a moving target. So, these things are coming in, as they're solving problems, new ones are coming in. So like if you have reporting that says, here's an active list of all of the things that this particular project has wrong with it or right with it, then that gives people kind of a marker that they can say, all right, hey, well, according to this standard, according to this report, we are 80% or 90% or whatever, safe or easy to use. And we now know where we need to improve. But you can't even get that without having the first part, which is the information itself.
Yeah, and I guess the other question I have here is, right, there's a number of projects that are listed that are involved in this particular partnership, but and I think those are pretty much everything under the NumFocus umbrella, right?
Yeah.
But what kinds of projects should we expect to see looking for adopting metrics like these?
I mean, I genuinely think that any open source project should have the ability to adopt the standards that are being presented here. I don't know, again, I don't have enough knowledge of what they're doing with NumFocus and Bitergia to say like, here's the comprehensive list. I hope that they make that information public. I mean, it sounds like it says, private access to Bitergia analytics to build custom charts and dashboards. So it doesn't sound like they're trying to make that stuff public, but it's saying with those metrics, developers can better understand the health of projects. So my hope is that at some point, at least what they're calculating will be available to the public. And I hope that, that finds its way to major version control platforms. I hope, I know of a friend that's working on a project called Open Sauce that is kind of doing this very thing of like, making it easier for people to understand what is going on with an open source project, but they're doing it from the perspective of encouraging new contributions to these projects. But I could also see there being a money kind of positioning there to be like, yeah, but companies can also use this information to make right decisions as well. So my hope is to see that, open source projects, including ones that you and I maintain, will get to take advantage of some of the findings that come out of these types of big data research projects. All right, let's move on. I am excited about this conversation. Um, Folks, John and I often agree in different ways, so I'm always looking forward to hearing about how he agrees with me in many cases. But over in JavaScript world, there was an announcement that the company Remix, which makes their also named product, which is a JavaScript framework that's built around React Router, is getting acquired by Shopify. And when I saw this, I mean, other than the fact that there's a little bit of like, I know some of the people that work at Remix, so I am, super excited for them because I get to see that, hey, they're taken care of and all those good things. However, there have been a lot of acquisitions in the news lately. Some that are, I think the tech world would say is very polarizing. Some people are running, some people are, switching platforms and doing things. The difference here is, in many ways, those are not open source platforms. In this case, Remix was. It was a company that was built around this open source product. And we see this all the time in the JavaScript world where you have companies that are built around open source products. Full disclosure, I work for a company that owns open source products. I also worked for a company that was built based off of an open source product. So, John, I want to pose the question to you: who owns open source?
I do.
Okay, enough said. We'll see you next week.
There we go.
All right.
So it's an interesting question, which I think requires more of a definition of what you mean when you say own, because there are a bunch of different ways you can own code, and the answer to that question, I think, really depends on what your concern is when you ask it. Right. So, in terms of this particular project, I don't do a ton of JavaScript. I haven't used Remix. I'm gonna go out on a limb here and say that most of the code that goes into Remix, the library, has been written by employees of Remix, the company.
I think that's a safe argument.
Yeah. It's probably fair argument there. Yeah. But if it's out there, with an open source license, even if those licensing terms change, that's not retroactive.
Yeah.
So if something's been released as an open source library, ownership is really a fuzzy question there, in terms of like, I can still use this, right? Even if the terms of the use for newer versions of these libraries have changed. I may be able to use and fork and modify, the last version of the library that was released under the license that I like.
I was thinking about this earlier from like the perspective of, most of the companies that I've worked with now are publicly traded companies. Who owns those companies? I think the big argument would be the shareholders own the company. Now, again, I don't know economics. I know someone in the chat that does know a lot about economics, so feel free to correct me in any way there. But the idea of shareholdering a open source product is something that I feel has been very polarizing as of late. Because I mean, if we look at just the perspective of licensing, if a product is available for people to use freely, and a company builds a model off of that product, without giving back to the original company, who now owns that? Like, and there's an argument about that enough to the point where people will change their licensing model and be like, well, no, we're not being benefited from this development that's being made, or they're benefiting from the development that we're making without contributing back to it. And, I bring this up as a topic mostly because I feel like the Python community has been shielded from this a lot. But when you look at like how our largest packages are set up, like one, we talk about like NumFocus, who sponsors a bunch of projects. We have, a company like Anaconda who has their own version of packaging and like dependency management and things. And then you also have the fact that those two kind of work together a lot to build this data community and to kind of foster it. And then all of a sudden at PyCon, Anaconda announces PyScript, which is like, oh, hey, here's this open source product that like is actively on the web. It is bringing Python to the web. And in my mind, I'm like, okay, so this to me seems more like a JavaScript model of business than a Python model of business. Because when I think of Python models of business, I think of Python, the PSF, Django, and then like the DSF. And even with some of the smaller projects, you have, this idea for where an organization can be set up around protecting, if it's a community, the property and the intellectual rights of the community. But if it's a product, it's kind of the same thing. We have a steering council that helps make those decisions. We have a PEP process. A lot of that stuff goes into place protecting Python. But do those same things exist for the smaller projects? And I say smaller as in like not the main language, because Flask is the most widely used Python web framework on the planet for in Python. And it is ultimately maintained by one person.
Well, yeah, so I think that's why I was saying it depends on what you mean when you ask who owns this, because when I hear that question, I think, right, what's your concern? What answer are you hoping for? Because it's not likely that the the next step there is I want to buy it. I mean, hey, that's kind of what's kicking off this conversation to begin with. But
yes. For the record, I did ask the owner of Flask online earlier how much I could pay to own Flask, and he told me not enough. So I think we're good.
And I think the more interesting bit about that question is, right, going back to the idea of like community health metrics for an open source project is, how does this continue operating, right? Because ultimately, a lot of the time, your source code is kind of a liability, right? It's a thing that you have to keep up. It's there's always going to be CVEs. There are going to be new releases of various different underlying libraries that your code depends on, that you want to keep up to date with. And if all of that goes away, a maintainer retires, gets bored, gets a job doing something that is not related to the framework they work on, that maintenance burden then becomes your maintenance burden, or just a liability in general.
Yeah. So we have a really good question in the chat, and I'm going to also pose this to the greater chat. So if you're watching us live on YouTube or on Twitch or LinkedIn, like chime in, because I want to know this as well. What does ownership bring? Like, is it control? Like, why is it important to understand like who is the owner in this case? Is it control? Is it rights? I would also throw like exclusivity into it as well. I saw earlier someone was talking about a social network that specifically states that they don't operate in certain countries because of, whether it's data control rights, privacy rights, geopolitical rights. Marietta, who, hey Marietta, Marietta's a very influential person in the Python community and is a part of, the core dev team. He mentions like influence and power. So does the Python Steering Council own Python? And I'm asking these questions because I genuinely wonder who gets the final say when someone says we want, big company here wants to control this product.
Yeah, I mean, I think, right. I'm also going to mention that earlier today, someone said to me, congratulations, the prize for winning the cake eating contest is more cake. So, influence and power is not the only thing that comes with maintenance there. Right. Control is a blessing and a curse, right? Because when you're maintaining something that a lot of people depend on, you do have to think about things in a different way that is not just like, okay, I feel like making these changes today and now I've rewritten it and it doesn't, now you're dealing with essentially customer support, but your customers are people who use your stuff for free. And
I've heard they have the most complaints too.
Yeah. And so, but in terms of who owns Python, a lot of people have contributed to CPython, right? And this is a good question. I don't actually know if CPython has a contributor license agreement. So I don't know, and maybe somebody in the chat can provide some insight there. But I don't know if you adding a piece of code to CPython relinquishes control. So who owns it? Maybe so who owns it may be like the Python Software Foundation itself. Who controls it, right? That's like the steering council and the various folks on different blanking on a word here, but like subcommittees that deal with things like packaging and security and all of the kind of specialties that end up within a code base as large as Python's.
Yeah. And I mean, you also get to kind of look at when we talk about control, I mean, I'm looking at this from the JavaScript standpoint of like, you have a company that is able to make money in order to develop this thing that other companies feel they will need. Or they have some product that they built that is the money-making arm, but is fundamentally reliant on this open source technology that maybe they also created. I look at Vercel as kind of a good example of that, of like they have this whole like Vercel platform, but then they also have like Next.js, which is kind of this thing that they've developed, and I think a lot of that was probably to make the platform. And then we also look at things like Netlify and these companies that create tools for you to use and even put your products on. So then, do you own your IP? Like if we put our website on Netlify, which we don't, our site is hosted through like GitHub Actions and all this other GitHub pages or whatever. But I guess we could say the same thing. Does GitHub own our site? Do we own our site? Who owns the code in which we've put on there? Like, I don't know the answer to that, because what I do know is that we have some power right now to say, well, if we don't like how GitHub is hosting it, we can put it on, Python Anywhere. We can put it on Netlify, or we could just host it ourselves and like, put it on some laptop that's just always on. We probably will not do that. But there is also a shared ownership and looking at like what Heroku did with, or I guess what Heroku's doing with getting rid of their free tier, regardless of whether you owned it or not, you can't do anything with that code on Heroku without paying Heroku. So do you own it or does Heroku own it?
Yeah, I mean, there's a common thing you'll hear about not building a business based on someone else's business, right? And this is an issue that comes up in the world of like anyone that has like monopoly or anything approaching that, right? You become essentially beholden to whatever they decide to change about their platform at any given time. So for our site, right, for pythoncommunitynews.com, it's just static files, right? Right. So it's served by GitHub pages, but I
really quick, it's served using a static site generator that you and I have worked on.
Well, I was getting there.
Okay.
Give me a moment, Jay. So it's static files that are served by GitHub pages, and these are right. This is a thing that you asked the question: does GitHub own this? They very much do not, and they do not want to, right? Because there are implications when a web provider does own something, right? And so there's like safe harbor laws that are involved in like, if we post something, we're not speaking for GitHub and it's not GitHub's content, they don't want any part of that.
And and if they chose to take us down because we wrote it, there is a possible argument of violation of safe harbor, which is where we get into the news of, sites that people may not necessarily agree with, and I mean, I don't agree with a lot of it, but the argument is like, well, take them down. And they're like, until they violate the law, we kind of can't. But I mean, the answer is like, you can. It just sets precedence over who actually has control.
Yeah. And so at the end of the day, though, if we decided that GitHub pages wasn't the right fit for us, we would pick up our site and move it elsewhere. And as you mentioned earlier, this is built on a static site generator that you created called Render Engine that allows us to essentially take our source files and output some flat HTML and upload them anywhere. And so that can be GitHub pages, GitLab pages, like you said, a laptop in a closet. It can be any web host that's capable of serving up HTML. We can put that site on, and right, if someday when someone says, Jay, I want to buy your static site generator from you, and then changes it so our site no longer works and can't render our archive anymore, we can still pick that up, move it to a different static site generator. So that is where I think a lot of this question about ownership comes from. Yeah. Right? Because my worry when something changes hands isn't necessarily like, well, now the person I was paying for a service before, is no longer that same entity. As I'm depending on this as part of like building my business, my worry is more around the idea of, well, does this introduce any risk for me? Is this thing likely to change in a way that makes it so I can no longer operate?
Yeah.
And this is where you hear about everybody talking about multi-cloud and all of these other approaches to essentially de-risk any of your components. You can switch between them, and it's often a lot easier said than done.
I think it's interesting because you said it's the static site generator that I built. Like, I'm not the only contributor. Like, you've contributed to it. I've had other people contribute to it in the past, but it's still looked at as like it is my project. And there's a book, and I don't have the book on me, that's like about open source that kind of talks about this idea of like there are four types of open source projects. You have like toys, which is what I would put, Render Engine in, is something that I built to solve a problem that I had. And then I started using it and making money off of using it. And I was like, hey, this is great. I can adapt that a little bit. And then you have like stadiums, which are a handful of people working on a massive project. And I would put something like Flask into that. I would almost even put something like, Python into that. Like, for the number of people that use it versus the people who maintain it, it's very lopsided. And then you have like these projects that are kind of many to many relationships, where it's like a bunch of people are working on it and a bunch of people are, using it. And then you have like clubs, which are, a lot of people, using it, and or I guess a few people working on it. Read the book. I will find the book and throw it in somewhere. But like I would have said that Render Engine is the like, I mean, I guess I would have said it is my project. So if I said who owns that, I guess I would say that I did, because at the end of the day, like, that's mostly because the repo is in my name. Like, if I shut down the repo, like, I guess I have all of the control. Like, I have the code. I mean, I guess someone could fork the code and say they're going to go build it on their own. But then, like, unless they get a larger following than I do on the project, which, I mean, I don't think would be that hard, but like, it's my project. But I look at larger projects like Django. One of the comments that came up recently for the DSF is that they are actively, like, I think today is the last day to submit for the DSF board nomination. So again, if you know somebody that might be interested in serving on a board, like, today's the day. But the way that their bylaws are set up, they have term limits. So they have to hire, like, they have to quote unquote hire, they have to nominate people to come in to be the guardians of that project. And it's not to say that if they don't, then, the project goes away, but the control of how that project is maintained fundamentally changes. And that could be a good thing or a bad thing. Because when I think of like what Python projects are most likely to become the next JavaScript web framework to get acquired by some big company, I do think about the web frameworks that these million and billion dollar companies use. And, the developers aren't making that money. So at the end of the day, if a large company said, I want to buy Django, here's $15 billion, or, I'm going to pull a random number there, like $42 billion or whatever, like, that's a very hard question if all of the control is in the hands of one person. If you have a foundation and you have a bunch of people and there's a process and you have to go through all those things, even if you want to do that, it's a lot harder. It's a lot harder for Python to become an Amazon or Microsoft or Google property, because you can't just say, here's a blank check, we now own this. I'm pretty sure all of the major companies would have tried by now. But when it is just one person or 10 people, 5 people, 10 people, they don't even have to buy you. They just have to hire you. Congratulations, we've hired you. Now we have all the influence of the project.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not always that easy, because project maintainers don't necessarily want to just kind of sell away, right, what their vision for a project is. But you're right. There are potential issues with an open source project. I'm a lot less worried about an open source project getting picked up by a company and then fundamentally changed into something else than someone gets hired to do a job that right just isn't that project, and
Yeah.
now they're busy. Because I think that's one of the main um, sorts of weaknesses in these models that are right. I am one person that maintains a project. Is anytime I have something going on in life, now that project takes a back seat.
Yeah. I definitely have. I feel that. Like, that is my current life status. Is like, I'm working on all of these other things. I have these things that I built that I would love to do more work on, but unfortunately they don't make enough. So we focus over here. And we talk about that in even in like, how do core developers work on Python? Like, you have many of the developers who are basically working on it in their off time and nights and weekends. You have another set of developers who might be allowed to work on it 1 day a week from their employer. And then you have a small handful of people that are able to focus on it full time and get a paycheck from their employer. And usually their last names in with like Van Rossum. And it's like, okay, hey, you made the language, like, okay, foster it. And then now he has a team, like there's a team at Microsoft that does this, and I have an article about that and all that stuff. But like, the that is very much a rarity in all of open source development. Like, usually if someone is working on a project full time, it is because they've received enough funding that they can continue to focus on it full time. And I don't even know how many of those people are actually doing that. Like, most of the core developers of projects that I know also have a day job.
Yeah, I think there are also some folks left out of that list, which are right the Python developer in residence
Yeah.
position, which looks very similar to the Django fellowship positions.
Yeah.
So people who are right, paid by the foundations that are ultimately responsible for maintaining these projects to actually like really spend uh, you know paid employment time on continuing the improvements and continuing to grow the language and the framework.
Yeah.
Because I think you look at the article you mentioned where right, hey, here's a bunch of people working on Python, and look at all of these performance improvements we've gotten. Well, uh, I'm not all that surprised to hear that when you uh, get a well-staffed group together and pay them to build something they want to improve, you get good results out of it, right?
Yeah.
One of the one of the conversations I've had with people a lot over the years is like the speed of JavaScript, right? JavaScript is or Node, right, on the back end, right, is relatively performant, which is I would say definitely due to just the sheer amount of resources that have been poured into its development,
Yeah.
and not something inherent to the language itself. And right, you see a lot of those things with that 3.11 release and the upcoming plans for 3.12. Um, but but yeah, I mean, in terms of to kind of circle back to your opening point, right, the Python community I think does trend more toward right like foundation models and right the Python Software Foundation has its fiscal sponsorship program to help right projects and conferences work without necessarily building up all of that legal structure that would be necessary in order to accept money, um, while protecting yourself from right just doing it as a person, um, and it takes a lot of money, time, and energy in order to actually make those things happen, right? The Django Software Foundation and the Python Software Foundation, these things don't just like magically come into existence, right? They've been built up over years and decades, and so right, if you want to see like more stuff like that continue and more of this code going into kind of like the public good, I think contributing there, whether it's like you said by uh, self-nominating to serve on a board or donating to their fundraising campaigns throughout the year, things like that. It does help kind of keep the ownership more in the public than it is private.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think, yeah, to wrap this up really well, I mean, the answer is like a lot. It depends. But in many cases, there's like a balance of ownership. And that's why I kind of did like that, shareholder model. Like, okay, if all of the power is nested in like one person, then that person has the ability to make all the decisions. If by design the power is distributed across the platform, as long as everybody is doing their part, it becomes a lot harder to make any big swinging decision. But ultimately, those systems are harder to maintain, at least logistically. Like, I mean, the PSF does elections every year. And John, I know that we've talked a lot about this in your conference chats. Is that people can't do these things forever, and whether it's writing code, whether it's organizing an event, people cannot do it 24/7, and they can't do it for years and years and years on end unless it makes sense for them to. And even then, like I would dare say, I don't. At least I hope that John, you're not like 50 years down the road still sitting there being like, I really wonder like how Pi Gotham is going to, I wonder how they're going to make sure they have food this year. Like this is not a thing that I hope for you, but there is always an opportunity for people to give up some of their ownership and to pass it on to someone else. And if there was a call to action for any of this, it's like if there's a project that you rely on, whether it's whether you is the big company you, or whether you is the just you, it's like support those developers, support them by helping to triage issues, support them financially if you can. But ultimately, the more that you support them, the more that you will have a small ownership of that thing. Now, obviously, I can't promise you that, you file a couple of bugs and now you're like co-owner of Python. That's not how that works. But I've had the privilege of talking to a lot of people that have all said the same thing. I started off reading issues and answering them. And then one day someone said, well, what if we just give you commit permissions? And it's amazing at how a little bit of effort gives you access and a little bit of ownership to a project that now you are responsible for in some ways. And when the question comes up of, hey, this person wants to sell this thing, or this person wants to, give up on it, you now have a little bit of a say in that. So all that to be said, again, whether it's Python, whether it's Django or Flask or whatever you're using, support those projects that you've come to rely on. Make sure that you're supporting the maintainers of those projects. Like I said, it doesn't have to be financially, but it certainly can be. And, at the end of the day, like if a company, like I wouldn't say that a company owning an open source project is necessarily a bad thing. Again, I've made my entire tech career working for companies that own open source properties. Well, one of them was open source and then they changed their license, but which is a whole another conversation. But all that to say, if you don't like who could potentially own it, then the only thing that you can do is work to become a little bit of the owner yourself. John, we got a couple of conferences coming up.
We do, yeah. I think
Kind of excited about this. The first one, kind of a big one. Most people know about this, but it is PyCon. We talked about PyCon happening, but ultimately, recently they said that they might need some help.
Yeah, so PyCon US has put up a call for volunteers for. I think this post is specifically about reviewing calls for proposals. So, and on that note, the call for proposals for PyCon US 2023 is open right now for at least a few more weeks. But the program committee is going to be reviewing all of those proposals in order to actually select what gets presented at PyCon US 2023, and then build out the schedule for the event. If you want to be part of that, check out this blog post and get an idea of what it's like to actually contribute to an event like this. I've done this for a number of conferences. It's a super fun experience. It can be a lot of work. I'm not going to sugarcoat that. There are a lot of proposals that get sent into a conference like PyCon US, and so if you have if you want a hand in kind of helping shape what gets presented in the following year, take a look at that blog post. And if there are other ways you want to get involved in running PyCon US or other conferences, there's some links in there that will help you out.
Yeah, we also have another organization that is also looking for some volunteers as well, and that is JupyterCon. They're also looking for some reviewers as well. In 2020, they had over 1,000 submissions. This upcoming year is in Paris. The deadline for that is December 15th for the CFP. But they're going to be looking for some people to actually review some of these CFPs. And they're asking for people, you can also choose which tracks you feel most comfortable, helping out in and working in. So kind of the same thing. You've got, a big industry. I know the data science community is massive. Jupyter, it has, really made the data science community, or at least the idea of writing code, more accessible to folks in the data community. So I would highly encourage, if you're in that space, if you have some knowledge in that space, or you just want to help make that event as good as it can possibly be, then you can go in and sign up. And again, we're going to have all the links to these in the show notes and in the description on the YouTube channel, as well as in the podcast and newsletter. And lastly, we have Python Ireland, which this is interesting to me because I went to EuroPython, which was also in Ireland. So I was like, oh, awesome. But this is kind of the smaller event that's focused mostly on folks in the Isles themselves. And if you are in that area, if you're nearby and you wanna support them, they're going to be at the Radisson in Dublin. So be sure to go ahead and give them a reach out to and get your tickets. Well, I guess I'm not gonna say tickets are almost like not sold out, but like the conference is happening next week, so you're running out of time to get them. But John, I think that's gonna wrap it up for this week. I think we had a couple of things that we wanted to tell people. Of course, as always, if you have a topic that you want us to cover, or if you're wondering about, hey, how come we didn't talk about that other topic, you can tell us. You can go to our GitHub repo. We have an organization that's set up, and we have a topics repo that you can go in and submit the topics that you want to hear. We actually had a couple this week that we're saving them. There's still a little bit more information that needs to be gathered before we can talk about them too much. But We always appreciate it when people from the community help, and it also helps us a ton because both of us are doing things during the week, and unfortunately we can't hear about everything that happens. So whenever you see something that's happening in your area or your area of expertise, share it with us by going to github.com/python-community-news, then /topics, and file that issue. But also make sure that you're checking out, if you've enjoyed the content here, make sure you subscribe to the YouTube channel. You can also subscribe to the newsletter, and we also have this as a podcast available to you. If you're listening on the podcast, hi, how are you doing? But we also do a community brief. John, you're really good at explaining the brief, so I'm going to kick that over to you.
Yeah, so the Python Community News weekly brief is under 5 minutes. It's just the facts about all the news that happened this week. So if you're tired of listening to us drone on for this hour, you want to just know what happened. I got places to be. Go subscribe to the podcast. We have a weekly brief that comes out, be out later today or tomorrow if you're listening on a live stream, and that will give you kind of the headlines, all the content that you'll get from the newsletter, just in podcast form.
And of course, if you forget about any of this stuff, you can also follow us on Twitter and YouTube. We're both at Pi Community News. YouTube we have the handle. It's like youtube.com/@Pi Community News. That's a new thing that they rolled out. You can also just search Python Community News on YouTube and find most of our content there. And of course, we're still on Twitter. I know a lot of people are saying for now. There's a lot of stuff happening there, but we're on Twitter for now. And if anything changes, you can find all of this information at pythoncommunitynews.com. But John, am I missing anything?
I think that's all for this week. So I've been John.
And I'm Jay, and this has been the Python Community News.